Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes. This is Legal Matters, the program that's been designed to address critical and sometimes contentious issues that are facing businesses and consumers today. It's legal information, practical solutions, and straight talk about a wide variety of topics that will affect your home and work life, and today it'll be about your work life. The partners from the Bazar Grasso law firm in East Providence continue to be supportive of our cause here and topics that we address, and we appreciate their donating their time and their experience and their expertise. So let's start by welcoming Jackie Grasso and David Bazar.
Hi, Debbie.
So if you are thinking about starting a business, good for you. There are things that you should know. If you have a business, you're still concerned with, or should be concerned with, some of the possibly crippling litigation that could confront you if you don't handle legal matters correctly. So today what we're going to do is have a little bit of an overview, starting with a startup, pre-startup actually. What things do you need to know? What decisions do you need to make that can affect greatly how you will do business? So let's start with a little bit of a tutorial. If someone is thinking of starting a business, and we've all been there, what considerations first do they have to take into account when thinking about the legal form of business? There are several options and they all have impact.
So there are several options, and oftentimes what happens is you have to look into the consideration of protecting yourself from liability and what tax structure you want. And there are different corporations that can do both, but with different impacts on the tax structure. So I often say, ask your accountant what form he suggests for tax purposes, because the liability that the legal entity can give you for protection from can really take many forms. So what are some of those options? A lot of people who start out in business don't do anything, and they start as a sole proprietorship, which leaves you open to all sorts of legal liability and consequences, and makes the taxes pass through to you directly. That may be what you want. If you want the taxes to pass through to you directly, you could choose an LLC, which is a limited liability company, or a subchapter S corporation from a company that's incorporated. Partnerships do not really limit you on liability, although there are some different forms of partnerships that can limit the liability of a limited partner in a limited partnership, although the general partner still has liability. And the bottom line with any of this is you should have insurance.
That's another topic too. Jackie?
So you should always have liability insurance, and it's not just for the typical slip and fall that most people would think of as liability. Your insurance agent will go over different policies that you may need, and number one is the liability for personal injuries. The second one would be workers' compensation insurance. If you have employees, you absolutely have to have that. You may have business owner's insurance. So for instance, if I have some kind of a catastrophe at my office, like we did have one.
Right.
Our office was flooded and we were closed for 3 or 4 days, and we had coverage to take care of the damage,
Right.
and at the same time we had business
Interruption
insurance, so we were able to at least recoup the losses, the business losses. So there are several forms of insurance that you need. Some of them can be combined in one policy. Workers' comp, of course, is a separate policy. There's also coverage for employees. What's that? Now, if an employee sues you as an employer for sexual harassment or some type of liability, then that's a different policy, not normally covered under your personal or general liability policy.
And you could also go the other way with an employee dishonesty policy that protects you if an employee steals or does something that you need protection from.
And even the product itself, if someone has a restaurant, they might have special insurances and special other liabilities to consider.
Right.
Now, today there are many courses that people take online, sometimes in small business, as many of us have either taught or gone through, and they walk you through the steps of what it takes to start a business. In general, if you haven't been through those procedures in that course, is it possible for someone to, at least at the startup, be able to do his own investigation of which form he might want to take? That with a conversation with his accountant, as you're suggesting, do they really need to have a lawyer right at that start?
It's not absolutely necessary, but when you speak with an accountant, your accountant's going to tell you to see an attorney. And
Yes.
when we see people For startups, we tell them to see an accountant, so we're constantly doing
Yeah,
this.
pointing at each
But they both coexist. We both coexist, and I do think it's necessary when you're starting up a business. Even if you go in for a consultation, we do offer free consultations. So even if you want a sole proprietorship, there's no form of organization. You don't have to go through the Secretary of State. But at least David and myself will give advice as to what the liabilities are, the personal liabilities, and the tax ramifications to some extent. Like what would happen if you're not paying your taxes? That's where we come in legally. Of course, the accountant obviously is going to give you more information on the finances.
And when you take those courses, it may teach you a number of different things, but it doesn't give you the expertise to make certain decisions. And so when you're choosing a form of corporation, whether it's an LLC or a subchapter S or a C corporation, which all have different ramifications and different effects on what type of benefit plans you can have and what type of 401k or other savings plans for retirement you can have, there's also another aspect to it, and that is when you're starting a new company, oftentimes you need capital. And what type of corporation, what type of entity is going to be the best for raising capital? Are you trying to raise capital from investors? Well, you may not want to have a sole proprietorship because how is somebody going to invest in a business that's just you? You may want to be able to sell stock. Now, of course, that raises SEC issues and all that kind of stuff that you need to explore and understand. That's the Securities and Exchange Commission. Or if you're going to raise capital by borrowing money from a bank, the bank is going to want to know what the entity is. If there's more than one partner, what is the succession plan? What's the buyout plan? What kind of partnership agreement do you have? Those are all things that a lawyer can explore
Plus,
with you.
the bank will definitely want a business plan.
That was the second
yeah.
part. If you're going to try to raise money, whether it's from investors or from a bank, you want to develop a business plan to be able to show this is the plan, this is how we're going to make money, this is what we need to do to become profitable.
And generally, those who have gone through the small business development centers across the country, generally they are suggesting that you get an accountant and a lawyer on board, maybe even to be on your board, to help guide these things through. Back a moment ago, you were talking about should a company decide that at some point, shortly down the road, they want to raise capital. They need to be a corporation C, S?
Don't need to be, but there are some advantages to different corporation structures, such as a C corporation or an S corporation. The S corporation is the one that passes the taxes directly through to the shareholders. The shareholders are the people who invest in the company and own the business and appoint the board of directors that runs the business, that hires the officers that are the day-to-day operators of the business. So even though you may be opening up a small shop, it's the same structure that the businesses that are listed on Wall Street follow when you do that. So as that type of corporation, it's a much better structure theoretically to raise capital. Certain limited partnerships are also a very valuable way of raising capital because the limited partners who invest money in it and don't have the exposure to liability may invest, and there may be better tax consequences in doing it that way. So it's complicated. That's why you need a lawyer if you're opening up a business, particularly where you need investors.
And we didn't want to put you on the spot to be handling issues as accountants. That may be saved for another day. But while we're talking about 401ks and forms of compensation, can you briefly address what happens if you are a sole proprietor versus having a corporation? Who has to take money? Everybody wants to make money out of their business, but when they have a business, the question is who has to have a salary? Anyone, or versus taking money as it's available, like a sole proprietor may?
As a sole proprietor, you're taking a draw, you're not taking a salary. So what's a draw? If you need $500 a week, you take it out of the office account and keep a record of it. If you have employees and they work more than 1,000 hours per year, then they qualify for a retirement plan if the employer offers a retirement plan. But if I myself, as an employer, even with a sole proprietor, offer a retirement plan, I have to offer it to any employees that work more than 1,000 hours. Now, unless the IRS has changed that regulation, the last time that's what it was.
And what it is in a corporate structure, you can have a 401k plan. And as Jackie's saying, you have to treat people in the plan with the same options as everyone in their class within the plan. So as an owner of a business, you can have a class that is for directors or officers. You can have a different, when we had it for a law firm, we had a certain structure for attorneys, a certain structure for paralegals and other staff. So you can have different structures of how that plan works, but it has to be monitored, and I would set it up with a company that is a benefit specialist, with an investor that takes the liability away from you as being the person to invest the money. I wouldn't want that liability. And if you're the trustee of it, I'd want to have a fidelity bond. Just like you have insurance for other things, you should have insurance for that. Other structures, there's a simple plan that you can have, which is much less costly to institute, and it has different rules as to how much you can invest into it, but it might serve the purpose. And if you have a sole proprietorship and you're just worried about yourself, I think you still have those KEO plans or simple plans.
Steps.
Yeah, exactly, that you can use to create your own retirement plan.
And while we wrap up this portion of the startup, when someone makes a decision that they are going to incorporate, can you tell us what the costs are for that versus an LLC? What's the actual filing and arrangement? What happens and who does it?
Well, there's
Set by the Secretary of State.
Yeah,
Different filing fees for different things.
exactly.
We know what they are.
The LLC in Rhode Island filing fee is maybe a little bit less initially than the corporate filing fee, but every year there's a $500 fee for the LLC for taxes. Whether the taxes are passing through to you directly anyway, there's a corporate fee that's paid every year. I know they've been talking about changing those corporate fees.
It's the
I
same
don't
thing
know.
in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Last time I did a Massachusetts corporation, it's been a while, but I think for a small subchapter S, the filing fee was $125.
Yeah.
So it's been a while.
Well,
It's
and
probably increased since then.
They have raised them.
Yeah.
And in Mass, I believe the LLC fees are more than the corporate fees. But the difference is, I think the taxes are less.
Yeah.
I don't know they have that mandatory $500 fee that Rhode Island has for LLCs for taxes. So the cost of it is not the significant thing. Filing fees are, depending on what you file, not all that significant. And the attorney's fees aren't that significant just to do that paperwork. Where you can spend some money, and you may want to spend some money, is in creation of bylaws or partnership agreements, buyout agreements. If a corporation's run by 3 people, you might want to have a cross buyout with life insurance funding that, so that you know what's going to happen if somebody leaves or somebody dies.
And while typically a company's best asset is its employees, it can also be one of its greatest nightmares. So before we get into that topic in and of itself, do you also handle, or do lawyers generally handle putting together, I don't know, a handbook so that everyone knows the rules and regs that keep, as you pointed out earlier, an employer from being charged with sexual harassment, or even knowing the rules of who's legal and who's not?
Quite simply, if it's a small business with 2 employees,
Good point.
we will advise what is legal and what isn't legal with regard to employees. If it's a larger corporation, I think we may have done one long, long time ago, but in that situation, you also want to consult an attorney who specializes in employment law, so that they know all the ins and outs, with the Americans with Disability Act, Older Workers Benefit Protection Act, because when you lose an employee, there are things that happen legally as well. So, you need to be sure that you have an exit strategy. And if you're laying off an employee, are you doing it legally? If you're firing someone, what are your responsibilities as an employer? For instance, in Massachusetts, if you get laid off or fired, you have a right to your employment file within 24 hours. You have to be paid right away. So there are different requirements for different states.
And there are different laws, federal, state, as Jackie's saying, that apply to different size corporations. The Family Medical Leave Act only applies to corporations with more than a certain number of employees. ADA may apply to any business where you have to make reasonable accommodations for someone who has a disability, and on it goes. So a handbook won't address necessarily everything. It might incorporate some of the laws that are applicable to your business or not. We can help craft those. When it comes down to, as Jackie's saying, a specific case that's arisen, you may want to then consult a lawyer who's an expert in that employment field.
If someone, as I had mentioned earlier, goes to SBDC, they might get a little bit of insight on the kinds of questions they should ask. If someone goes to see a lawyer, if it's a small company, as you pointed out, are you likely to sit them down and walk them through, be aware of, you need to check this, and you just went through a litany of things that may or may not apply to someone at a given business. Is that typical that you would go through a checklist, a punch list for things for them to consider, if not make a decision on that day?
Yeah, we have a checklist. The first thing and foremost is financing, raising capital. The second thing, which we always require that they do, is get your licensing. People just forget.
Good point.
If I'm opening up a repair shop, you need to get licensed. You need to go to your city and town, and you have to get a license to operate that business. And all of the other factors, do you have insurance? We refer them to an insurance agent if they don't. We'll also refer them to an accountant if the person doesn't have an account. All of the factors that we just discussed.
While you were on that, and you bring up a good point, so if someone's starting a restaurant, maybe they need a liquor license.
Correct.
But if someone is in a service business, many people who've been laid off decide that they'll become entrepreneurial and want to start a small consulting kind of business. What are the licensing requirements of cities, states, and towns? How do you get to find that out?
If you're operating out of your house and you have a business and you have a sign on your front lawn, you need to be licensed. There are also ramifications for signage as well, so you need to be sure that you're in a zoned area to have a sign. If you're operating in Massachusetts as a homeowner improvement, doing home improvement, Massachusetts has specific requirements for individuals going into that business, and there are things that you absolutely have to do. Even in Rhode Island, you have to register as a home improvement contractor because not doing it, you can have a great issue.
It depends on the business. Every business has some regulation and some requirements, and it depends what you're doing. If you're opening up a retail store of some type, you also have to have the right tax permits to collect sales tax and make sure you're filing those taxes correctly. So when the person comes in, the first question on that issue is what kind of business are you going to run and what kind of licensing is required, and that may be city, town, or state, depending on what it is that they're doing.
So while you're talking about staving off some potential liability, what about protecting clients from themselves when they've come up with a swell idea or a new company name or addressed patents and trademarks in broad brush strokes?
That's an extremely specialized area of law, and you do need to go to an attorney who is licensed or registered, a patent attorney it's a separate bar. So they even take a separate bar exam. So you do have to do that.
If someone is just creating their own logo, does that need to be protected?
Does it have to be? No, but would you want it to be? Yes.
Okay.
And a business name. The first thing we do is a corporate database search of the name, because if you're using a name that's similar or the exact name is another corporation in the state, you're not going to be able to use it. Right. So first and foremost is we reserve that name right away. There's a small filing fee for that, but we make sure that's available.
Is that a DIY, do-it-yourself effort, or does a lawyer require?
Anybody can go into the corporation's website and reserve a name.
Right. And when you do that, what you're doing is, as Jackie said, checking the names, because you can't operate a business under a similar name to someone else. It's deceptive. And the Secretary of State won't allow that. But then you can reserve it, and then when you incorporate, you have the paperwork to go ahead and use that name. But trademarking it is different than using it as your corporate name. That doesn't give you protection. It gives you protection against someone else using that corporate name in Rhode Island if you've registered in Rhode Island. It doesn't protect it from someone using it elsewhere in the same area. That's where trademark comes in.
Many years ago, we had a lawyer, who David knows probably personally, who used Mickey Mouse or something, a caricature that looked like Mickey Mouse as a signage, part of his signage on his law firm. And lo and behold, you know what happened with that is Disney sent him a cease and desist, correct, and there was litigation that resulted.
But he had his Mickey Mouse rings on his finger.
That's correct.
So what about copyrights for a second here? If you open a restaurant, a little deli and you want to play music, is it the entrepreneur himself who is to know, I have to be careful about what music I play, whether it's free, it's licensed, it's copyrighted, can I play this for public broadcast? Is that a responsibility that he has, or is that something that you're going to be making him aware of as he's going through, or you're going through due diligence with him?
Yeah, so music is a specialized area where they have these so-called unions or whatever that try to enforce every copyright. Scram is what it should be called, but I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, and so if you are playing music, you're supposed to license it through one of those organizations, and they come out to your restaurant. If you are making money off of music in particular, banquet halls that have bands come in and play, they go look at those things. So if you're playing music, there are some requirements that you need to look into.
Good. Okay. And considering, as I was mentioning, everybody has to have some employees unless they're just working solo. Without leaning on you to be HR specialists, everyone's going to look at a resume. Makes sense. What else can you suggest that an employer will have to look at so as to be on the right side of the law when it comes to not discriminating about age, and/or is that person a documented legal citizen? What do you ask? What can you ask? What can't you ask?
So you certainly can ask them permission to do or have them sign something to do a background check if you want to go that far, to really order one from the Attorney General's office, the BCI, or you can do one in general yourself or hire a company to do that. Depending on what the business is, you may have to do that. If it's a daycare, I'm pretty confident that you'd have to get a BCI check.
To make sure that
there's no criminal background.
Okay.
All right, and then in terms of assuring that they have the proper identification, once you hire them, you could ask for identification and a social security number and have them sign the forms and give you sufficient proof that they are who they say they are, whether that's a driver's license and a passport or birth certificate or social security card. Those are different ways of doing that.
That covers the employer.
After you hire them.
And what about, I'm telling you that I'm a certain age, but I'm actually not, and you might really want to hire someone that's only of a certain age. How do you get around that?
Well, that's a lawsuit waiting to happen.
Yeah, I would stay
You
away
wouldn't
from that.
ask a person his or her age. You wouldn't ask a woman if she's pregnant, or if she plans to get pregnant, or if she's going to be married and raising a family. All of those raise red flags.
Can you ask, how do you plan on handling, should you have children in the near future? Can you ask that?
I think that's a reasonable question. It's kind of it's a gray area.
Yeah,
I may want to stay away from it.
You're getting close.
Yeah.
Do you think travel will be a problem because we think we need you to do that?
That's fair.
That's
Yes.
fair? So it does make a difference how you phrase that question.
Absolutely.
Suppose someone is in the tech industry and you are representing or you're working with them. There's a good possibility when they hire someone that employer might care very much about the terms and when someone leaves,
So
how they leave, disclosure,
Protecting
compete.
secrets.
So yeah, you want an
Non-compete
employment
clause.
contract. Again, you want to use a lawyer for that. Please use a lawyer for that. Do not get something from a local office
Yeah, or a
store
computer.
or the internet. You want an employment agreement. You want a non-compete clause. Lawyers will advise you how long a non-compete is reasonable, how many miles is reasonable. Typically speaking, if you live in Idaho, 30 miles is reasonable. If you live in Rhode Island, non-compete for 2 years for 30 miles, unreasonable, because you
depending
can
on
drive
what-
through the
Good to know.
state.
Depending on what it is.
Correct, yeah, correct. So,
And do you ever have to defend those who are trying to work in the state of Rhode Island because they find out later that they had signed a non-compete, but in fact they do need to continue working?
and you've done those.
We've
I've
done
done
a
them.
number of those, and it depends on the type of business, what your job was at the business, what your restrictions are. So as Jackie was saying, it has to be reasonable in length, time, duration, that's time, distance, and what you're stopped from doing. They can't stop you from doing any job. It has to be something related to what you were doing for them.
And perhaps undermining of them potentially, if you can show that would undermine, they took a client of 3.
And so I've had, just by way of example, a fellow who worked for a very large pharmaceutical or pharmacy in Rhode Island, and he had a very high position, and he was barred from doing that type of job for, say, 3 years in any other type of pharmacy across the country. And the issue is that reasonable? And it was, because they do business across the country. And so what we had to argue in that case is the type of job he was doing at the new company was significantly different than the one he did at the old company, so that the type of work that was being barred wasn't what he was going to do. And we reached an agreement that that was in fact the case. But it depends on what your job is and how wide-ranging the company you're working for does business.
Okay, and one other employment issue. So if you're an employer, wouldn't you like to save money on taxes? Sure. I think I'll hire everyone, or not hire them, but keep them all as freelancers. Address the independent contractor versus part-time employee. What's the difference and how do you handle it?
Well, if it's an independent contractor, that means you as the employer are not taking taxes out as not taking withholdings, federal or state. You're just giving them a gross check, gross wages, whatever it is, and they're responsible for their own insurance. The individual's responsible for his or her own taxes. You have to give them a 1099. That raises red flags as well.
Yeah, if you control their hours,
Yeah.
where they work, when they work, the tools that are provided for the work, the courts will look past what you're calling somebody. You're saying, well, they're an independent contractor, 1099, but you have all the indicia of employment, but some of those things I just told you, then they're not going to be a 1099 employee. They're going to be an employee, and subject to workers' compensation laws, subject to taxes, and all the other things that you're supposed to be providing.
And the IRS will come knocking on your door, as well as the State Division of Taxation. They do audit businesses.
They do.
Yeah.
And part-timers, they don't have to be paid. They have deductions, but are they also 1099?
No. Well, they
If they're
can be if you
Yeah, it
want them to be.
depends.
It depends on how you're controlling the employment
Right.
of the person, but
And that's what I was asking, that because some employers would want to say it's only part-time, I don't
can't make
really-
up your own rules
Okay.
as you go along.
So you have to put them through the paces of doing this, or would that just be an accountant's? Should they be asking the accountant that?
Both.
Yeah, it's both. And frankly, here's the issue. If you control when somebody comes into work, so let's just take someone who comes in and types for us. If they come in whenever they want, take the work home and do it, I think it's an independent contractor. But if you say, I want you to come in, use my computer, type it between these hours and answer the phone, that's an employee.
And it's easier to be ahead of that rather than trying to defend
Absolutely.
it later. Of the thing, we've touched on so many topics here. Of the things that you can and can't do for someone, mostly these things you can do, how do you end up charging for these beyond getting them to be incorporated or not? Do you have an hourly fee, or do you just say, here's a small business package, we're going to give you 10 hours over the next 3 months?
Depends on the type of business, how complicated it is. We do have a flat rate for some of those.
Good to know.
That's it.
It looks like it's time to wrap up.
I hear that.
We hear the sound. Thank you for tuning in. Please stay with us. The discussion of legal matters will continue.